To you, O Lord, for you alone are our rock and our Redeemer. And let all God's people say, Amen. So to set the context, let me offer a brief history lesson. For those of you that have been around for at least a couple of years, you'll recall that in 2022, First Presbyterian Church celebrated its 150th anniversary. Having been founded in 1872 by a small gathering of Presbyterians on the banks of the Poudre River with an evangelist and church planter called Sheldon Jackson. And that congregation then became a group that met in a couple of church buildings in what's now Old Town on Linden and Walnut. And then eventually, in 1914, they settled here on this property. Well, not quite here exactly. The church was built out on the lawn where the tent is set up for the picnic. In fact, I'm told that underneath the grass where we're going to have the picnic in a few moments, there are still some of the remnants of the original foundation of that sanctuary built in 1914. So if any of you are budding archaeologists, there may be a future dig out there. Well, that church here in 1914 continued to grow over the decades until they got to a point where they had really outgrown that space, and they were faced with a critical decision. Do we stay here downtown and try to expand this campus, or do we move, like a lot of other churches downtown had recently moved? Do we move way out to the suburbs, by which I mean Prospect? And this church in the late 1950s said no. After prayer and discernment, we believe that we are called to be a downtown church, that we are called to serve the community from this place. And so in the late 1950s, they launched a very ambitious campaign to raise money to build an education wing, the yellow brick building that still stands just to the west here that you pass every time you come into the church. That yellow education building looked in the initial drawings like this. Michael, do we have that photo? So the perspective here is a little unusual. It's actually taken from the perspective if you were standing where I'm standing now, looking south at the back of the sanctuary and then west at the education building. They were built to be connected to one another. If you've ever wondered why that education building is a half floor above ground to the second level, it's because it matched the sanctuary of the original church that was also a half floor above ground. That early 20th century campaign, by the way, to build that building was $200,000 for a 23,000 square foot building. $10 a square foot. Wouldn't it be nice if you could buy a house in Fort Collins today for $10 a square foot? You can't buy a dog bed for $10 a square foot. That's a fact. Thank you, Michael. Then, in the late 1960s and early 70s, it was determined that that beautiful sanctuary had fallen into disrepair, and the cost to rehabilitate it was prohibitive. And so, again, the church faced a critical crossroads. Do we stay here and build a new sanctuary, or do we move out to the suburbs, which then was probably Drake or something? And the church again prayed and discerned, no, God is calling us to be a downtown church. In fact, the pastor at that time, Jim Baird, said, the congregation has decided to remain at the heart of the city so that we can share the gospel in the marketplace. Isn't that an interesting phrase from 1973? To do this requires, among other things, Baird wrote, facilities which both lend themselves to such ministry and are attractive and inviting to the public. Our programs are in full swing, and now we need the tools for this ministry and mission to thrive. Early 1970s vision of this church. Tom McComb, who was the chair of the building campaign in the 1970s to build this sanctuary, his daughter, Molly Skold, by the way, is an active member today with her husband, Carl. Tom said, "We believe this project will make our campus the center of downtown activities and be a meaningful and positive addition to the city of Fort Collins." And so the decision was to stay, to build this sanctuary, and then to take down the old sanctuary, and then eventually to raise enough money to fill out the fellowship hall, Shepherdson Hall, the office suites, and the rest of our campus today. In 2017, we began thinking about how we could be better stewards of the campus that we've inherited from those who have gone before us. And so we realized that education building had a lot of availability of space, and there were many in the community who needed that space. So we started reaching out to nonprofit partners, including the Matthews House, one of the largest and most effective nonprofit partners working with children and youth and their families in Fort Collins. They eventually put a community life center here in our building. And many others followed, so that today we have a couple of dozen nonprofits who are regularly using that campus to provide vital programs and outreach, especially to vulnerable populations here in town.